Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Cameras for Creatives workshop. We're going to get started in just a moment. I can see people joining, and I just wanted to make sure that we give people just enough time to join us on the stream. If you are coming to us from our website on mnn.org and you want to participate in the chat is available on our YouTube channel. So you just go ahead and click where it says watch on YouTube on that video, and you'll be able to see the chat. You can leave comments, you can leave questions, which we will address at the end of the presentation. But come on in and join us in the chat here. Say hello, tell us where you're coming from, and we will get started momentarily. All right, welcome to our Cameras for Creatives workshop. My name is Sean Mannion. I am the manager of media education here at the New York City Center for Media Education. I'm sure I've spoken to, emailed with, or maybe even seen a few of you in our workshops in the past. Again, as I was saying a moment ago, we are live on YouTube. And if you're on our website, that link that you were sent when you joined, you just go ahead and click on the watch on YouTube. You'll be able to see the chat. You'll be able to send us your comments, your questions. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions as we go. We will be addressing questions towards the end. Some questions we may address in the chat. We have everybody's pal, Deshaun Pretlow, with us. On the back end, keeping an eye on that chat. He'll answer some of your questions as appropriate there, but we'll save a lot of them towards the end. I am coming to you from our brand new classroom at 38th Street, what we call Classroom A. It's a classroom where you'll be taking editing classes, computer-based classes. You can see just a little hint. I'm not going to show you everything, just teasing a little bit. Teasing our new classroom here at 38th Street. So welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to make this presentation full screen. Occasionally, I'm going to pop up again because I've got some of the equipment that we're going to be talking about on hand, so I can point out a few more details about, or at least show you what we've got. Hopefully we'll all be able to bring you in soon. Keep an eye out for classes. Make sure that you sign up for the newsletter so you know as soon as those classes are available. And classes you'll be able to sign up for classes when they're available on our new Center for Media Education dedicated website, cme.mnn.org. And with that, let's dive into what you're here for, which is the Cameras for Creatives workshop. Let's just go ahead and bring those slides full screen. Yeah, we've got Cameras for Creatives. Again, my name is Sean Mannion. I'm the manager of media education. Before we dive into it, just wanted to give a quick reminder of what's coming up this week. This is the second day of our Winter Summit. If you missed the kickoff last night, the video should still be available up on our YouTube. You'll be able to see our presentation or our Q&A. We had a great Q&A in our new screening room last night. Tomorrow night, I'll be hosting a panel, The Present and Future of Low Budget Filmmaking, panel discussion hosted by me. The panel discussion is going to address what has been working for filmmakers, reflect on the current state of the independent film ecosystem, and explore what filmmakers can do to face these challenges. We're going to have two filmmakers, Victoria Negri and Jacques Soare, joining us. And we're going to have Joseph Shahadi, who is the executive director of the Art of Brooklyn Film Festival. And we'll be coming to you from our screening room. The exact same link that you followed to get to this presentation from that email, that's the exact same one that you're going to use to get to tomorrow night. We tried to make this as streamlined as possible, so less links, keep it simple. We're very excited about this panel and the conversations we're going to have around filmmaking. Thursday, it's the only day that's really different. It's going to be on Zoom, and it is our Connect and Chill speed networking for creatives. So our whole team is going to be on Zoom with you. We're going to break out into breakout rooms, and you can all talk, get to know each other, introduce yourselves, hopefully make some connections so that you can kind of build up your own network and find new people to work with on your creative projects, which is, if you saw our presentation last night, it's a big part of what we want to do as the New York City Center for Media Education, is to help to facilitate more connections between creatives so you can create your projects. So this is a big part of what our plans are coming up. Friday, we've got another panel hosted by our Director of Media Education, Tiffany Blunt. And this one is on virtual production. It's called Inside Virtual Production, what it is and why you should care. So the panel is going to explore what is virtual production. We're going to have people, our guests are going to share their process and creative projects using virtual production technologies, and talk about the impact of this technology and what impact this will have on the future of storytelling. So we've got Adrian Miranda, who is a content creator. I have Steve Evans, who's an immersive media producer, and we've got Andrew Anaceto, who works in sales for Moses Engineering. And Moses, you can look them up. They make devices that attach to the camera, so you can track the camera, which is super important for virtual production. So we can get a couple of different perspectives in there, and we're excited about that. And we're excited about the future of virtual production and possibilities here in at the New York City Center for Media Education. So that's what we got coming up the rest of the week. Wednesday is the same link you followed to get here. Friday is the same link that you followed to get here today. Thursday's on Zoom. All of that information is in all the links. They're in the reminder emails. If you have any questions, email us, education@mnn.org. We'll be happy to help you to find what you need. So let's get into what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to be talking about cameras. And broadly speaking, there's three big topics today. Camera fundamentals. Now, some of you may already be aware of these. They're kind of the basics of like working with cameras. Things like ISO, shutter speed, aperture, but also like how do these fit together? Like, and why does it matter when you're picking out a camera? Like, I need a camera for a project. They're all really relevant to making that decision about your camera. Like, what do I need for my project? And that's really where this whole workshop is kind of geared towards, is there's a lot of cameras. There's a whole lot of cameras available out there. How do you pick what you need for the project that you're doing? Because people will often ask, whether it's in a workshop like this or whether it's in any of the other kinds of classes that we've done over the past decade plus, what's the best camera? What camera do I need? Well, it really depends on a lot of things. Some of it is really driven by these camera fundamentals. what are the features on the camera that you need to accomplish your project. So we're going to do an overview of that. We're going to do an overview of different sort of broad categories of cameras so that we can talk about that. We can talk about details on what are the best uses for these different types of cameras. And then we're going to talk about essential accessories, because once you start talking about getting a camera or borrowing a camera or renting a camera or however you're acquiring a camera, you also have to start thinking about all the other things that go with it for the kind of production you're doing. And not every production needs all of this. Not every production needs audio. Not every production needs you to have a stabilizer, but many do. And so we'll talk about how these play into different types of productions, all with the goal of hopefully helping you understand a little bit better about what kind of camera and what kind of equipment you might need for the productions that you are planning coming up. And so let's dive in. Oh, and one more thing, please hold your questions to the end. If you happen to have something really pressing, you think you'll forget it, feel free to drop it in the chat. We really won't address many of them until the end. We've got a section set aside for it. And that's just so that we can kind of keep it moving. But we do want your questions, but please just kind of hold on to them to the end. If you do put them in the chat before the end, it's fine. We'll try to flag them so we can come back to them when we get to the end. Okay? So let's dive in on camera fundamentals. So the first thing with this, just kind of broadly, is to understand that there's a few things that are universal with cameras. It's just how the cameras work. And so we want to make sure that we're starting with this baseline understanding of these are the features that we're talking about with cameras and how they're going to work. Because fundamentally, what's important to understand is no matter what camera we're talking about, whether we're talking about digital cameras, whether we're talking about phone cameras, whether we're talking about action cameras, whether we're talking about old school analog cameras, which isn't really a big part of today, the thing that you need to understand is that cameras are recording light. And all of the features we're going to talk about are controlling how the camera records light. They all have some kind of impact on the recording of light. And how changing those features will change the final image result. So the first thing that we want to break down with this is the camera sensor. And this is the most important component of a digital camera. The sensor is how it records an image at all. And the sensor is analogous to a film in a traditional film camera. So it's not exactly the same, but it's similar. Film is what recorded light in analog. The sensor is what is going to be recording light in a digital camera. So the sensor also dictates a lot of the features that you're probably most interested in, like low light performance. Oh, I need to shoot at night, or I need to shoot where I can't set up lights. Might be shooting inside. Maybe you're doing stuff at a club, or maybe you're shooting just kind of out in the field and you can't set up. Well, you might need something that has better low light performance. The sensor makes a big difference for that. More creative drives like depth of field, which we'll talk about in more detail as we go. Which lenses you can use. All of this is kind of driven by the sensor. The sensor is really the core of what you need to be looking at and what you need to consider that you're working with your camera. Cameras with the larger sensor are going to capture a wider field of view, which means just more image, more of what's in front of you. A larger image sensor is going to pick up more of that. It's going to see more. Full frame or 35 millimeter equivalent sensor size is kind of the standard that we compare everything to. And that's partly because We have that as a standard from film. 35 millimeter film has long been one of the main standards, and everything else is either smaller or larger format than that when we talk about film. And it also can produce images with a similar field of view to the human eye. So you have kind of a similar, with certain lenses on it, you have kind of a similar view. If you stand next to where the camera is, you and the camera see roughly the same thing in front of you. Other sensors are usually described in relationship to being full frame. They're often described as cropped. So a couple of the other sensor sizes that you might hear about that are different sizes are, and that we will talk about today, Super 35. It is slightly smaller. It's a little bit wider. It's slightly smaller on the vertical. But it's very, very close to the same thing. Super 35 versus 35 or full frame. When I say 35 millimeter, I'm also meaning full frame. We have APS-C sensors, which is and similar, which are slightly cropped in. It's this first red box that you see in the image example. And then there's Micro Four Thirds, which is the second little red box there. You see how they're each a little bit smaller. And then when you get to the center box, that will be a 1-inch sensor. So those will all be described as cropped. There are sensor sizes that are larger. There are large format ones or 65 millimeter equivalent, but we're not really going to cover those because once you get into those formats, we're talking about scarily expensive cameras. And we don't want to get into those today, but they're out there. What's important about that sensor size too is not just the field of view, how much I can see, but it's also that the larger the sensor is, the more light it captures. Because it's larger, there's more surface area, like physically we're talking about. It's physically larger, so there's more surface area. There's more area for the light to touch, so we can capture more light. So when it's in low light conditions, what little light is there, it's picking up as much as possible. So large sensors are nice for that. And that's not to dismiss the other smaller sensors. They are very, very useful. And what it is what you're always looking at when we're talking about this is going to be trade-offs. And that's why we're starting talking about these camera fundamentals. We're talking about trade-offs. So this is the sensor. So one of the things about the sensor that's important to understand is ISO. So ISO, some cameras, they call it gain, and it looks a little different. The numbers are a little different for it, but the principle is the same. You go up, you're increasing it. You go down, you're decreasing it. It's controlling how sensitive the sensor is to the light. The higher the ISO is, or the higher the gain is, the more sensitive it is, the more light it's going to show you. But the higher that number is, the higher up you go with ISO, the higher up you go with gain, the more noisy the image is. This is one of those trade-offs. Like, I will see more, but you'll have kind of static on it. You'll kind of have some noise on it. Now, most cameras, or all cameras, have a native ISO. And sometimes you'll see that as part of the marketing. If you're scrolling through on the B&H website or any camera website, Adorama, Amazon, whoever, when you're scrolling through and you're looking at all the features for the camera, you might see it says native ISO. And what that is that's the highest ISO that the camera can have, where you get a relatively clean image, a minimum amount of that noise, a minimum amount of that sort of static on the image. And that's kind of considered the starting point for the sensor sensitivity when you're thinking about shooting. So you would either go up and increase the ISO because you need more sensitivity from that native, or you might go down because you want to decrease the sensitivity because you're in a really bright environment. You don't need that. You don't need that much. Typically, that native ISO on most sort of prosumer grade cameras, things like A7Ss or the Canon DSLR range is something around like a 400 or an 8. Sometimes it might be as much as an 800 on some of the nicer, the higher end cameras. A lot of professional grade cameras have a dual native ISO, or they'll have two ISOs that you can choose from. Usually one on the low end, again, like a 400 or an 800, and then one on the much higher end in like the 16,000 range or something like that, where those are the 2 points at which you'll have a minimum amount of noise. And so that's something that you can encounter in some professional grade cameras, where they'll have those two options available. But ISO is important. It's very helpful for being able to control the light. It's about, and again, it's all about the sensitivity of the sensor. You're increasing or decreasing the sensitivity of the sensor to the light that is hitting the sensor. So next we want to talk about the aperture. Now the aperture is a function of the lens, and different lenses on different lenses will give you different aperture options. So it's referred to in f-stops, and the smaller the aperture is, the smaller the number is, the smaller the f-stop number is, the larger the aperture is, the more wide open it is. And this is the thing, I like to really kind of hit on this a little bit, because folks tend to find it confusing at first. If you're new to this, it can be a little confusing. The smaller the number, the more wide open it is. Sometimes I like to think of it as, well, the closer to 0, the more like a 0 it's going to look, the more like an O it's going to look like. Sometimes that helps, sometimes it doesn't. But that's one of the things that I use. So the wider open that aperture is, the more light it gets in. Again, we're thinking about how much light are we capturing. So sensitive sensor, large sensors, very sensitive sensors with the ISO, more light, we're capturing more light. Wider open aperture, lower f-stop number, more light. So that means better in low light. That means we don't need to add as much light. And the wider or larger, the more open that aperture is, the shallower the depth of field is going to be. And I'm going to get into depth of field and explain a little bit more later, but aperture is one of the main controls you have over depth of field, which is, for example, like having a blurry background. That's usually what people kind of focus on or think about when it comes to depth of field is, oh, I want to do sort of a portrait looking shot. I want to do something that looks a little bit cinematic. I'm shooting a close-up of somebody, and so I want to get their face, but I want the background to be there, but I want it to be out of focus. I want it to be a little blurry. And that's what we're talking about with depth of field. And the wide open aperture is one of the things that'll give you that. So something to think about with depth of field is the more light going into the camera, the more light that the camera can capture, the shallower the depth of field is going to be. Now, again, we're going to go into more on the depth of field in a few minutes here, but I'm just kind of introducing this concept right now. So aperture is another thing that we can use to control how much light is going into the camera. And it's going to vary from lens to lens, like how wide open you can go. So 1 is usually the maximum that you can find. Most lenses will not go that wide open. 2.8 is a pretty common one that you can find. That's very wide open. For most consumer zoom lenses, 4 is about as wide open as you can go. And that's not bad. Like, a lot of people look at that and they say, well, I wish I could go to 2.8, or I wish I could go to 1. And those are great. But you don't always need them. And that's one of the reasons why we're going to go through all of this for this workshop. Shutter speed, again, another way that we can control light. So shutter speed is one of the things that is, it's a little bit of it's not exactly a holdover from analog, but it's the sort of thing that maybe made a little bit more sense when we talked about analog film. So with analog, with using film, you have to close off, you have to block the film itself from the light until you're capturing the image, and that's called the shutter. So when it opened, the light would hit the film would record it, and then it would move on to the next frame of film. But that shutter would have to open, and how fast it opens and closes is the shutter speed. Now, that's not exactly what happens in digital cameras. In digital cameras, the sensor is pretty much always, as long as the lens is, you have the lens cap off and there's light going into the lens, the sensor is always sort of exposed. But it's this in the digital space, this is more of a factor of how you're recording. So when you go to record, or when you take a photo with one of these cameras, it's a little closer to that. And what it is, it's the length of time it's exposing every frame of video for. And why does this matter? Well, when we're shooting video, or if you're taking a photo, you're capturing moments in time. We're going to talk about frame rate in a little bit, but you're capturing moments in time. You're capturing tiny little instances of time. And if the shutter, this virtual shutter in this case, is open for a long time, things move, even if we're talking about half a second or a third of a second, which is what we're talking about. Shutter speed is very, very short. We're talking about fractions of a second here. Even with that, like, there are movements that happen. A person shifts slightly, somebody blinks. Well, it's capturing that whole moment in that period of time. So what you'll get is something you've probably seen a lot, which is motion blur. You see, like, if you pause on some things, you'll notice it's kind of blurry. It looks, you caught it mid-movement. And that's because the image was captured for a period of time in which it was moving. It was in more than one place at a time, so it got all of that. Now, if you make that shutter speed much faster, you won't have that, because if you pause it on a single frame, what you'll get is the very instant when it wasn't moving, when whatever it was wasn't moving. Now, that's kind of a creative use of shutter speed. Typically, what you're going to do, as it says in the slide here, is you're typically going to look at what the frame rate you're using is. Again, we'll talk about frame rate in a minute. And you're going to make sure your shutter speed is twice that, or really not so much twice that, but that the denominator, the lower number. So it's always fractions. So it's like, if I'm doing it at 24 frames per second, which is very common for film, if I'm doing it 24 frames per second, I'm going to set my shutter speed to about 1/50th. Usually you get 1/50th as an option, not like 1/48th, which would technically be double. But it's that denominator, it's that lower number is what you want to set it to, 1/50th of a second. And so that just kind of gives you a much more natural look. Like, that's the look that you're used to when you watch most films, most television shows, is you're used to a shutter speed that's about double, where the denominator is about double your frame rate. Now, you can adjust that shutter speed to get a lot of different effects. Like, you can have more motion blur, and you get kind of an interesting ethereal look to things if you take that shutter speed and you slow it down. You make it slower. You make it closer to 1 second. So in the case of, we're talking about 1/50th, if I went down to 1/25th, that would be slower. If I made it 1/2, that would be slower, be very slow. Now, if I speed it up, go up to 1/60th, 1/80th, 1/100th, you're going to get a tinier sliver of time. The other trade-off with this is the less time that the sensor is exposed for, the less light you're capturing, because it's capturing light over time. So your image will get darker the faster the shutter speed is. The further away it is from a second, the closer it is to 1/100th, 1/20th, 1/240th of a second. These tiny fractions of a second. There's less light that can get into the lens. You need to add more light. We'll talk a little bit more about practical use of this in a minute, but there's a lot of interesting creative uses you can use that for. So like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about depth of field. And two of the biggest factors in depth of field are the sensor size and the aperture. So if you have a large sensor and you have a wide open aperture, you can have a very shallow depth of field. And the depth of field is the depth in front of the camera that you can focus on. So that may be as much as hundreds of feet, or it may be as small as a few millimeters. Like it might be just the distance from the tip of your nose to your eye, or it might be from right in front of you all the way to a tree 500 feet away and everything is in focus. It could be either one. But you can kind of think of it as the three-dimensional space in front of you, the sliver of it that you can focus on. And you can move that focus. When you adjust the focus ring on the camera, you're adjusting where the depth of field is in front of you. You're adjusting the point at which that depth of field is focused. So it's... except when we're talking about having things in focus, which technically is something important, depth of field is mostly a creative choice. It is not a necessity. A lot of people see it and they're like, oh, well, I've got to have everything has to have this depth of field. I've got to have shallow depth of field for everything. And that's just not true. Like that's not relevant for everything. There's a couple cameras we're going to talk about that are going to be sort of focused on like, yeah, you don't need to have a shallow depth of field for everything because it's not relevant to the project that you're working on. You can mix and match it. If you have shallow depth of field in one shot in a project, not everything has to have it. It should just be relevant to what you're doing. Do I need to see what's beyond? So I've got this image as an example, and the young woman is in focus. And behind her, things are out of focus, just as an example of the depth of field. And one of the things I like to point out with images like this is that depth of field is not like a hard edged thing where it's like this is in focus and then nothing is, and then everything else is the same amount of out of focus. There's actually, it changes with the depth. Like there's the woman and she is in focus. There's the blue box behind her, and that blue box behind her is slightly out of focus. But when you go to the trees, they're more out of focus. When you go to the street beyond her, you can barely even tell that there's a street or what's there because it's it's very, very out of focus. And so you get that kind of grade of it. One of the other factors that comes into play with the depth of field, so you get there's the aperture. There's the sensor size. Those are kind of giving you your baseline for depth of field. But even if you have a smaller sensor, even if your aperture can't go open that wide, you can still get a little bit of a shallower depth of field. You might not get all of what you want, but you can still get a little bit of a shallower depth of field if you work with two other factors, which is a long lens. So when we're talking about lenses, you talk about wide angle lenses, which are like 18 millimeters, 24 millimeters, 35 millimeters. Those are wide angle. That's going to show you a lot of things in front of you. Or you have a long lens or telephoto lens, and that might be an 85 millimeter, 100 millimeter, 200 millimeter, 300 millimeter lens. So the longer the lens is, the shallower the depth of field is. So a 15 millimeter lens has a shallower depth of field than a 24. 85 is shallower than 50, 100 is shallower than 85, and so on. Like you shrink that depth of field the longer the lens is. So what you can do is, well, I don't have the biggest sensor. I can't get the widest aperture. But if I go to 100 millimeters, for example, on a zoom lens, if I go to 100 millimeters, I might be able to get a little bit more of the type of depth of field that I want, the shallower depth of field that I want. But also distance is a factor. If you put more distance between your subject and the background, between yourself and the subject, which you might have to do if you're going for a longer lens, you have a little, you can kind of cheat the depth of field a little bit. So this woman was probably shot on maybe a 50 millimeter, maybe an 85 millimeter from a few feet away, maybe 5 or 10 feet away. But if we got on like a 200 millimeter lens and got, another couple dozen feet away, we could probably get the same shot and a very similar effect without as wide open an aperture. So there's a couple things you can play with. So experimentation is important. And one of the things that I hope will come through for the rest of this day is learning the camera device that you're working with and learning to what its strengths are, what its weaknesses are, and how you can accomplish the things that you want is really, really important. Like, it's not necessarily that there's going to be one of these cameras that's absolutely going to do everything that you need, that we're going to talk about here, but that there are a lot of cameras that can give you a lot of different options. And if you learn the strengths and weaknesses of those cameras, you can accomplish a lot of what you want, which is one of the reasons why we're covering these fundamentals before we get into specifics on cameras. So I just mentioned frame rates a little bit ago when I was talking about shutter speed. If you're not already familiar, frame rate is how many images per second that your camera is recording. We're not recording continuous motion when we shoot digital, just like when people shot film. You're not really recording continuous motion. What you are is you're capturing individual points in time, and you're playing them back fast enough that people cannot tell that it's not continuous motion. It just looks like continuous motion. And so that is, so it's 24, 30, and 60 are three of the most common frame rates in the US. If you're outside the US, it'd be 24, 25, and 60, or 50 rather than 60. And I'll talk about that more in just a second. But frame rate is important to understand, that is how many images I'm capturing per second. And again, that should also drive what your standard shutter speed is if you are controlling your shutter speed. So if I'm doing 24 frames per second, I want to choose a frame rate that's about 1/50th, or a shutter speed, excuse me, that is about 1/50th of a second. If I'm doing 30, I want to go for 1/60th of a second. So again, that denominator, that lower number, double the frame rate. If I'm doing 60, I want to go to 1/120th of a second. So just a quick breakdown of frame rates. When do we use them? So again, 24, 30, and 60 are what we're talking about as three of the most common, and the uses for them. You'll notice that there's other numbers on the next to them. Technically, when you shoot 24 frames per second, you're doing 23.976. When you're shooting 30, it's 29.97. When you do 60, it's 59.94. But we shorten it because it's easier to say 60 than 59.94 whenever we talk about frame rates. So, and it's so close that we might as well just say the other one. But this is technically what it means. If you're doing 24, if you're doing something that you want a cinematic look, short film, documentary, you want to shoot at 24 frames per second. If you're doing something that is for broadcast television, for the news, you usually want to do 30 frames per second. 30 frames per second is the standard for television, has been since the dawn of television. 24 frames per second, it was adopted by film because when we integrated sound into film, that is the frame rate that best synchronized with audio. And it was very important to synchronize with the audio. So that's what became the standard. And most films you watch are being projected You go to the movie theaters, it's being projected most of the time at 24 frames per second. 30 frames per second is also the standard on the web. You can publish things on the web at 24 frames per second, but if you're watching something on Instagram, for example, if you're watching an Instagram video, you're usually watching something playing back at 30 frames per second. And then 60 frames per second is usually not something that you're watching back. Sometimes streams are done that way. Sometimes televisions will sort of up things to 60 frames per second or a 60 hertz refresh rate. We won't get into that. But when you're producing, when you're creating, you might want to shoot things at 60 frames per second. If you might want to just add a little bit of slow motion to it. So for example, if I'm doing B-roll, if I'm going around shooting some B-roll, I might set that to be 60 frames per second for the shoot, because then I can slow it down by about half. Because I shot it at 60 frames per second, I can slow it down to 24 frames per second and have a little bit more than half speed, and I have 24 frames for that. Broadly speaking, you probably don't want to mix your frame rates. People do it. There's nothing wrong with it. In fact, I just encourage you to shoot your B-roll at 60 frames per second, even if you're shooting your documentary at 24 frames per second, all your interviews at 24 frames per second. Digital editing software manages this fine most of the time. 99% of the time, you're fine. And sometimes you might be using archive footage from like TV news, something like that, and that's going to be 30 frames per second. Unless you have to, unless you have a reason like that to mix frame rates, it's best to avoid it. Pick one, stick to it. And that's because 99% of the time in your editing software, you're fine. But what about that 1% of the time? Do you want to be the one who has to deal with that 1% of the time? I don't, usually. So I try to keep it consistent. I try to keep it at one point at 24 or at 30 or at 60. Usually I don't keep it at 60, but usually 24 or 30 is what I pick. And then if I have a reason to, if I have some specific use that I need to shift it when I shoot, I'll do that. But most of the time, pick one, stick to it. So motion blur, I mentioned this when we talked about shutter speed. And one of the things, again, shutter speed and your frame rate go hand in hand. But one of the things, and one of the reasons why I kind of wanted to set up your frame rate and shutter speed before we talked about motion blur is in depth, is that one of the times that you are most likely to want to eliminate that motion blur is when you're shooting in slow motion. So if I take that camera and I can shoot at 120 frames per second, well, I need to go and I need to set my shutter speed to be down to something like 240 frames, 1/240th of a second, excuse me, shutter speed to 1/240th of a second. Denominator is, that double what the frame rate is, or as close as I can get to that, depending on the camera and depending on the settings you have, you will see how close you can get. And the reason for that is kind of what you can see in the image. When you slow things down, you don't want motion blur. You want things to look like it's frozen in time for those, or for that, however the slow motion is. And that's something that a really fast shutter speed can give you. It can eliminate motion blur because you're getting those like fractions of a second where things are actually genuinely frozen in time when they're captured, because you caught it so fast it wasn't moving in the instant that you caught it, or it was moving so slow that it's not noticeable. So the faster you make that shutter speed, the more that slow motion is going to look like it's frozen in time. So that's one of the reasons why we talk about like making sure that you understand where your shutter speed versus where your frame rate is. Because you want to be able to, if you slow it down, have that so you don't have really blurry slow motion. Unless creatively that's something that you want. Maybe you want really blurry slow motion creatively, and that's fine. Like that's not what I would choose, and it's not what a lot of people would choose, but if it gets you the effect that you want, that's fine. And all of the things that we've talked about with this, they're technical, but they're also tools for you creatively, like experimenting with these features on whatever camera you're using to the extent that the camera allows you to, can give you some really interesting results, really interesting creative results. And there's nothing, honestly, to me that's been more fun in my career as a filmmaker as playing around with the camera settings, seeing what it gave me, using that, and then showing it to some other filmmakers and having them go, "Oh God, how did you do that? How did you accomplish that? Did you do that all in post? Like, what was the filter you used?" And you just say, "No, I just changed these camera settings and look at this crazy thing that I got. Doesn't that look cool?" It's fun. It's learning your camera, learning the camera in your hands, and how you can manipulate these settings, and really experimenting and getting comfortable with it is really the best way to find new opportunities to create unique and interesting images. So now we talked about all that technical stuff. We talked about these fundamentals of your camera. But now let's get into the different types of cameras. And so we're going to be talking about different types of cameras. And as we're talking about them, one of the things that you want to think about, and this is one of the things you want to think about as you're thinking about selecting a camera, is what your needs are. So for all of these, and we're going to break down some of these for the different types of cameras a little later. But you need to assess what your needs are for your project. And we typically recommend looking at budget. How much do you have to invest in your equipment? The type of camera you choose for your productions is going to be based on that budget. Like maybe you don't have one. A lot of us don't have one. I've certainly worked a lot in my career with no budget, nothing to spend. And sometimes it's just like, what can I borrow? Well, my friend has a DSLR. All right, we'll shoot on the DSLR. Or I have a little bit of money, I can go rent a camera. Well, I can rent, this cinema camera for the weekend, but I can only do it for like 2 days. Or you happen to own a camera, so already, or you're going to go out and buy one. But whatever your budget is, like, that's something to think about with these. And we'll go into it. Audio. How important is high quality audio to your production? Now, that really, really is going to depend on what you're trying to do. Not everything needs you to be able to record audio while you're shooting. You might do your audio separately later, or you might just throw music over it because you're not recording anybody's voices in the moment. Like, all of those are perfectly valid. You don't always need good audio for what you do. But there are some cases where it is extremely important to have great audio. Lighting. Are you going to be shooting in low light? Do you need to add light? Do you need a camera that will work well even if you can't bring in more lighting? And lens. Are you aiming to create more cinematic content? Do you need to be able to use different kinds of lenses? Are you fine with if you just use a built-in lens in the camera? So these are a couple factors. We'll talk about these with each of these types a little bit later, but these are things to kind of keep in the back of your head as we're going through the different camera types here. And the different camera types we're going to discuss, we're kind of lumping a bunch of different cameras together into a couple of types. We're going to be talking about mobile devices. We're going to be talking about action cameras. We're going to talk DSLRs. We're going to talk mirrorless cameras, and we're going to talk cinema cameras. They all offer a wide variety of price points. They all have their positive and negatives. We're going to go over some of those. And remember, as we're going through these, you need to assess what your needs are for your shooting. Like, okay, I'm producing. This is those things I was just talking about: budget, lighting, lens, and And what is your final destination for the project? Are you making something that's just for TikTok or Instagram? You might have different needs than somebody who's saying, oh, I'm taking this all the way to the Sundance Film Festival. The different needs. And neither is better or worse than the other necessarily. It's just where your content is destined for. And that's always worth thinking about. So we're going to start with mobile devices. And actually for this section, we're talking about cameras and also a little bit more later. I have some stuff with me. I have props. I have some of these devices with me. So I am going to pop up here so that you can see me here again in the classroom. Again, then we're at our new classroom over at 38th Street. Hello. So mobile devices, here's one of them. I've got, I'm a little out of focus there. I've got the iPhone 12 Pro Max. So this is one of the popular mobile devices that gets used. It's got the 3 cameras on the back. So as you can see in the slide there, a lot of the pros for these are that they are affordable. And by affordable, what we really mean, what we're really talking about is you probably already own it. Like you probably already have a smartphone. You may not already have a smartphone, but a lot of people already have them. So what makes them affordable is you probably already bought it for a different purpose. They're user-friendly. They are built for you to be able to just pick it up, find the camera app, and hit record and go. You can get more complicated with it. There are more complicated apps than that. But the design is really pick it up, hit record, go. There's a lot of accessories for these. There's a wide range, a growing range of accessories for mobile devices, whether we're talking about the iPhones, whether we're talking about Samsung Galaxies, whether we're talking about iPads. They're unobtrusive. Most of these, like you just keep it in your, I got a little shirt pocket there. I can just pull it out and shoot. What are some of the cons? Usually limited device space. So if you're shooting a lot, you either have to delete old stuff. Some of them you can plug in other hard drives, but that can become kind of an issue. They're usually not great in low light. And you may say, well, hold on, the iPhone is telling me that they can do great low light, or Samsung is really touting, or Google Pixel is saying like, oh, we've got this amazing low light capability. The low light capability of this camera is very different than the low light capability of cinema cameras, very different than the low light capability of mirrorless cameras, because it's not about how good the sensor is on this. And they're good sensors. These are not bad cameras. What it is the low light capabilities are enhanced by the software and the artificial intelligence in the device, which is good. It can look really good, but it doesn't look as good as some of these other ones. And that's, it's a drawback to it. It's not quite as accurate. It may be a little fuzzy. It may not focus as well in those low light environments. So you can use them in them. Your results may not be all you want it to be. There are recording space limitations with them often, again, because of the size in the device. Now, when I'm talking about these mobile devices, I'm not recommending going out and buying one just to make your projects. The advantage of mobile devices is that you may already own one. And the only reason I would encourage you to get a mobile device for video making, filmmaking purposes, for creating content purposes, is if you're going to use it for other things. Like this is my personal device. I use it to shoot video, mostly for social media purposes, mostly for like kind of lightweight production purposes. But that's not all I have it for. That's my phone. That's my email. That's a primary device I use for things like email and other contact. Like it is a lot more to me than a camera. So that's the advantage of it, and that's where the affordability comes in. If you're just looking at like, oh, I want to get an iPad Pro to produce a project on, like that's going to cost you almost as much as some of the other cameras that we're going to talk about. So when it comes to budgetary considerations, maybe that's not the best choice for you. But if you're saying, well, I want to get an iPad Pro because I want to shoot the video on it, but I also want to edit the video on it, and I also want to use it for email, and I also want to use it for production stuff, and I also want to use it just because I also game or something like that, and I like to game on the iPad. Like, great. It's great for all of those things, and you can use it for all of that. But think about that, not just as the camera. So just a couple of the examples, like I said, there's the iPhone and iPad Pro series. There's the Samsung Galaxy series. There's cameras like the Sony ZV-1. It's not exactly a mobile device. It is a camera on its own, but it's a very compact camera that you can just kind of pull out and go around with. And it's got a built-in lens and built-in zoom and all that stuff. Very lightweight and friendly, easy to use devices. There's a little bit of details under each of these. The iPhone's got that triple camera system. A lot of them have multi-camera systems now, which basically is just to give you different lens focal lengths. So you can have a super wide, you can have a regular wide, and you can have kind of their telephoto or their long lens, so you can get closer images. The Samsung Galaxy series, they offer, or some of the devices out there, they say, oh, you can shoot in 8K, you can shoot higher than 4K. Now, I'm going to address as we go a little bit more about these resolutions. But the first thing that I'm going to say about it is that if you're going to be a savvy camera buyer, somebody who's out there looking at these devices and really thinking about getting the most out of it, one thing that's important to remember is that those resolutions are often more of a sales point than they are a good feature from a technical perspective. It's more about saying, oh, it does 8K to get you to buy it than it is that, oh, it's actually a really good quality of this particular camera. 8K on a mobile device, it looks better than HD on the mobile device. But if you were to compare 8K out of a Samsung Galaxy to 4K out of a DSLR, or even regular HD out of a DSLR, doesn't look as good. And there's a lot of factors that play into that. There's a whole lot of factors that play into that. And the biggest one is really how it's recording the media, but also just the lenses, as nice as they can be, aren't as good. The sensor size is smaller. Like, there's a lot of different pieces that go into it. It's still good. It's just might not be what you expect it to be. So just be a little careful about that. That's one of the things that they like to say, oh, we got the really high resolution. You're going to get this really high resolution image, but is it going to be what you really need? Like, look at a couple of different factors. Sometimes people just look at that resolution. That's all they go for. And it's not quite enough. So with mobile devices, how do we control all of the things that we were just talking about, those camera fundamentals that we were kind of using as our baseline here? Sensor and ISO. Mobile devices have tiny, I mean, look at this. This is not a very big thing, and the camera's just right here. So there's not a whole lot of room for that sensor. It's not a huge sensor. And there's a lot of other things in these devices. So out of necessity, the sensors are small. It's less surface area for the light to hit. We already talked about, like, more surface area, more light. That's good. That's positive. That's what we want. You usually can control the ISO on these, whether you know you're doing it or not. If you're adjusting the exposure, usually on these devices, you're adjusting the ISO. The camera app may use software or AI to clean up the image a little bit. So if it is a really high ISO, that might be using the AI to get rid of some of that noise. But one of the drawbacks of that can be is you might have it might look a little soft or just a little bit of blurry because it's trying to anticipate what it should look like without the noise. None of this is bad. It's just to tell you this is what's happening under the hood. And lens and depth of field, most of them have at 1 to 3 fixed lenses. And the apertures are usually as wide as they can make them. Like sometimes they're even wider than a 1. There might be a 0.8 or a 0.9 in some cases. But even with that, like the lenses are usually a wider angle so that they can capture as much of what's in front of you as possible. So you don't have to get super far away to get a photo of your friend in the restaurant or at the party or wherever you're shooting your video. So you're not usually going to get shallow depth of field. Now, you may have seen that there's like cinematic mode on a lot of these where it's kind of creating that effect. And it's important to remember with that is a software AI design thing, and probably sounds like I'm really kind of being dismissive of the software and the AI. I'm not. I'm just saying that with these, that's driving a lot of those features is software-based, AI-based. And the shallow depth of field in these cinematic modes, it's not the same. It's trying to calculate it, and in some cases, you're going to get something that looks really good and indistinguishable from a higher-end camera. And in other cases, you're going to get something that looks a little weird. So, so kind of experiment. Always experiment and see what you can get out of it, and what you like and what you don't like. Like what is acceptable for you. Frame rate and shutter speed. Most mobile devices will give you the standard options for shutter speed: 24, 30, 60, sometimes 25 and 50. Many will also give you slow motion, sometimes up to 240 frames per second, sometimes more than that. Shutter speed is usually automatically adjusted based on the lighting. So you may notice when you're in low light situations that you get more of a different looking image. Like it's maybe a little bit more blown out in spots where there is light, or it looks like it's moving a little funny, and it's automatically adjusting the shutter speed. Almost all mobile devices that we're talking about also offer, you can get apps that will give you full control over things like shutter speed and ISO and frame rate, and give you even more options for it. And sometimes there's free apps for that, and sometimes there's very expensive apps for that. So other than mobile devices, let's talk about kind of a next step. Mobile devices, you might not want to buy a new mobile device, but you might need to go buy a camera. And one type of camera that you might want to buy is an action camera. And I have an example, one of these. I'll share it in just a second here. But action cameras, they're made to be compact and go with you to a wide variety of environments. And that's really the key to remember with these cameras. Usually you get a price range from about $300 to about $1,000, sometimes more depending, but that's kind of a typical price range that you can find. These are things like GoPros, they're drones, they're 360 cameras. They're usually pretty affordable, a few $100, and affordable comparatively compared to some of the other things we're going to talk about. Setup is simple. Pardon. They're almost always built for you to grab it and go. Grab it, hit record, and go. They're built rugged. Like if you want to see something that's a little wild and scary, look up on YouTube videos of skydivers dropping their GoPros. The GoPro goes all the way down and it spins, and you're sitting there watching it spin, and you see the sky, and you see the ground, and you see the sky, and you see the ground. And then it hits the ground, and it's still recording. And obviously, you can watch it. It recorded, and the recording was fine, and it dropped thousands of feet. And it was fine. That's how rugged some of these are, these GoPros and some of the other ones, is you can throw them and drop them, and they can go hundreds of feet underwater, dozens of feet underwater. And that's really what they're built for. Cons are there's limited image control. They give you options, but only so much. And there's very few moving parts in them so that they can be dropped as from the sky and still work. They do not work great in low light. They're action cameras. They're really built for being out and active, out in the world with the sun, and the, skiing or hiking or climbing trees or falling out of the sky as a skydiver. Even at the high resolutions, and these usually offer very high resolutions, 4K is a pretty standard option across most of these. The quality isn't quite as good. And this is similar to what I was saying about mobile devices. Like, you can shoot 4K, you can shoot 8K on some of these things. But if you were to compare it to like the cinema cameras or something else, it's not quite as good. And the only reason I emphasize this is because in my time as an instructor and here as a manager of media education and elsewhere that I've worked with people, I've seen a lot of people get really disappointed when they say, oh, well, I got this drone and it shoots 6K. And then they look at it and they say, oh, it doesn't quite look like I was expecting. It's because that resolution is not the only thing that we need to worry about. There's a lot of other factors that come into play. It's still good, just not as good. So here are a couple of examples of some of the common action cameras. We've got DJI drone cameras. They're able to get shots from the air. They can follow you around. They usually have larger camera sensors than the other ones we're talking about. It's usually a larger camera. You can remote control them oftentimes from your mobile device. There's GoPros. They're durable for action. They're waterproof. They're very compact. There's Insta360 cameras, which is the example I have to share with you today. So we have this Insta360 camera. It's very small, very compact. This is wider than a GoPro, but not much larger otherwise. They're very similar size. The handy thing about this is it's got, let's see if we can get that in the light. It's got a lens here. It's got a lens there. It can record from both of them at the same time. And if we were recording in here, I could kind of hold it up. I could get the whole room, full spherical view of everything. So you can shoot for VR, or you can shoot 360 video. That is, there's opportunities for that on YouTube to watch them, or Facebook. You get full 360 degree recording. You can get sort of normal recording with it too. But again, it's very small. It's about the size of a candy bar. Does not taste like a candy bar though. Don't bite into it. Learn that the hard way. And all of these, again, like advantages of these is being able to get into places that it's tough to get into with other cameras. Like this, I can mount this different places. This is very tight, compact. GoPros have been really well leveraged in inside cars, for example. There was a show online for a while that Jerry Seinfeld did, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And he would have a conversation with another famous comedian in a car. They'd borrow some really fancy older car. Almost all of the conversations inside the car were shot on GoPros. They just mount like 4 or 5 GoPros in the car, wire them for sound, and they just drive around and have a conversation, and they just record on all these different cameras at the same time, and just on these compact ones. That ability to be that small and have that kind of capture is really, really advantageous. So let's take a look at what are the differences for controlling the image. So you got the sensor and the ISO. Many have, I mean, it's a tiny device. It's gonna have it's not gonna have a huge sensor, especially for how much else it needs to do. The native ISO is usually pretty low on them, so you're gonna get noisy if it gets a little dark. Like even the space that I'm in right now, like I'd have a noisy image out of an action camera. I'm not getting quite enough sun in here. I'm not getting quite enough light. You have some control over it, but really, I would say that if you're using action cameras, you do not want to be doing them in low light. It's usually a fixed lens. There are sometimes like zooms that can happen inside it, but they minimize the moving parts because for that durability's sake. Depth of field is typically not a priority. In fact, I would say that for action cameras like these, like the Insta360, like GoPros, you're not looking for a shallow depth of field. For those, it's everything's in focus because they don't want you to be out of focus when you're skiing or whatever. Frame rates and shutter speed, they usually offer a wide range of common frame rates. And action cameras also usually offer you a wide range of slow motion options and slow motion at higher resolutions. And that's one of the emphasis that they have. And their shutter speed is usually emphasizes capturing motion, so they want to have a faster shutter speed. Another reason it's not great in low light. They tend to favor that so that you can get the cleanest looking action possible. DSLR cameras. Now, when we're talking about DSLR cameras, we're talking mirrorless cameras we're going to talk about next. They're very, very similar. There's a lot of similarities in pros and cons. There's a lot of similarities in usage. There's a lot of similarities in device type. So we're going to talk about them separately, but also together. DSLR, which stands for digital single lens reflex. It's going to give you a lot of flexibility. It's going to give you a lot of ability to create a more cinematic look that really mimics a 35 millimeter camera, which is one of the reasons why they've been so popular. They have a wide price range, as you see there, $500, $3,500. Large image sensors, a lot of them have full frame sensors. They're high quality, low cost compared to a traditional video camera. DSLRs have a heavy body. They tend to be a little heavy for their size, especially. Like it looks like something you should just be able to carry with one hand. But when you do, like carrying it with one hand can take a little time. They have a high learning curve. You can control so much of your image in these, but you have to learn how that camera works to do it. Audio recording limitations, they are not great with them. Older ones, you could only use built-in audio. Newer ones, you can plug in external audio, but recording the audio in the camera itself isn't great. DSLRs traditionally have recording limitations as well, and that's because of the computer that's inside the camera is set up to only save files that are, and this is shifted over time, but it's still an expectation that you should have, is that it will only save files as much as 4 gigabytes. Now, they've made changes and improved on this, but you should consider when you're looking at DSLRs that, oh, I have a limitation. I have to keep an eye on the camera. I can't just hit record and just keep going. There's a limitation. I'll still be able to record more, but it's just like 4 gigabytes at a time. Couple of examples, we've got the Canon 6D Mark II, Canon Rebel T8i, Nikon D3500. The 6D is a full frame sensor, so that's going to be great. Nice big sensor. You can get shallow depth of field. You get a lot of light hitting that sensor. It uses EF mount lenses. We're going to start talking with action cameras with mobile devices. You basically have whatever it comes with for your lenses. When we start talking about DSLR cameras, mirrorless cameras, cinema cameras, you can start putting other lenses on them. So Canon 6D Mark II are compatible with Canon EF mount lenses, which is a very common, very popular attachment type. That when we talk about the mount, we're talking about how the lens mounts to or attaches to the camera. The 60 Mark II full HD, it's not a 4K camera. It's a very, very nice camera, but it doesn't do the full 4K. Meanwhile, the Canon Rebel T8i will go to 4K at 24p, but that 4K, not quite as good as some of the higher end cameras, but it'll still do it. The Nikon D3500 also does not do 4K, it's just HD, and you can see the Nikon uses Nikon f-mount lenses, so it's a little bit different. One of the advantages of Canon's Rebel T8i series, which uses an APS-C sensor, which is a little bit smaller than the full frame sensor, is that it's also compatible with the EF mount lenses. It's compatible with EF and EFS. EFS is a little smaller, and EF is kind of the standard for full frame. And the reason for that is you can put a lens built for full frame onto a smaller sensor type, because it's just projecting light that isn't getting picked up by the sensor. If I put a lens that's smaller on, it's only going to put the image on part of the sensor. And I'm not going to go too far into that because it's a whole rabbit hole. But this is just to say that sometimes when you get a camera that has a smaller sensor, if it does everything else you need, you can still use lenses built for something bigger, but it doesn't go the other way. So mirrorless cameras, and we'll get into a little bit more about both of these in a second. Mirrorless cameras, like I have here, the Sony a7S III. Oh, let me put that right there. Got the Sony a7S III, which is also the camera that you're looking at me on. I've got that set up and running into our system here. So we've got the Canon a7S III. It's a mirrorless camera. Pros are very similar to the DSLRs. They have a wide price range. They've got the interchangeable lenses. I can take this lens and I can take it off carefully, press a button, remove the lens, put a different lens on, which gives me a lot more options for shooting. One of the nice things about mirrorless cameras is they have really impressive autofocus sensors. Sometimes with the nicer ones, even when you're shooting video, like it has a really great autofocus where it can track sometimes people moving. You sometimes don't want to rely on it, but they're getting better with each new generation, and they're really impressive what they can do with the autofocus on these mirrorless cameras. They are very compact, which means they tend to have a smaller battery. They usually have a relatively short battery life. Like I said, I'm shooting this on an A7S. I'm not relying on the battery. I have this plugged into power. Much like the DSLRs, they have a high learning curve. And you really need to start learning like all those details, like how does a camera work? How do we capture the image to really get what you need out of these cameras? There's grip issues. Because it's so compact, like sometimes, and there's a lot of little buttons on it, because there's a lot of manual control, like sometimes it can be a little difficult to handle them like this. When you have larger hands, you might accidentally hit a button you don't mean to. Some examples, we've got the Alpha 7 III, like what I've got here. We've got Canon EOS R6 Mark II, Nikon Z6 II. Audio connections for both DSLRs and mirrorless cameras are usually 3.5 millimeter, or kind of looks like a standard headphone jack is what you can plug in. You are more likely to find full frame sensors on mirrorless cameras just because that has kind of become the standard for them. That's really what's most popular. You're also more likely to find 4K on mirrorless than on DSLRs. A lot of them just default to that. You are going to have to look at it with different lenses than if you already had a DSLR, there are different lenses for a DSLR than for a mirrorless camera. And that's actually because of, I'm just going to do this for a second because I don't want to leave my sensor exposed for too long. It's because of the back of the lens. So the difference between DSLRs, the big difference between DSLRs and mirrorless cameras is mirrorless cameras don't have a mirror in them, hence the name. And because they don't have a mirror in them, they've got this smaller, more compact body. But the sensor is also closer to the lens. So the lens, that back that I just showed you, it's shallower on these lenses than the lenses you'd use for a DSLR. So unfortunately, a lot of our DSLR lenses can't necessarily move over to mirrorless if you switch between them. It's just something to kind of keep in mind with that and the reasoning behind it. And the 4K on these is, I was kind of warning you about 4K on action. I was warning you about 4K on mobile devices. But once we get up to this level, it looks good. It's a valuable tool in your toolbox. It doesn't look terrible in the other types of devices, action cameras or mobile devices. But the kind of 4K that you're imagining, the kind of quality that you're looking for, this is where you start to get it. That high-end look, that cinematic look. This is where you start to get it in the DSLRs, in the mirrorless cameras. And these give you a lot of control of your image, both DSLR and mirrorless. I lumped these together because they go together. They have full frame sensors a lot of the time, or they're very close to it with the APS-C. Wide range of ISO options. Some of the higher end ones even may have the dual native ISO that we were talking about earlier. Interchangeable lenses give you so many options. You can get prime lenses with really wide apertures, and they can give you a lot of really beautiful shallow depth of field shots. You can mount cinema quality lenses to these. Like EF mount, Canon uses that not just for their DSLRs, they also use it for their C100s and their other cinema camera range things. So you can get a really nice, ridiculously expensive lens and put it on a DSLR and get that kind of like beautiful cinematic image out of the lens. Frame rate and shutter speed, you have a range of common and uncommon frame rates for most of these cameras. You usually don't have as many options for slow motion. And when you do, it often downgrades the recording quality. So it goes from, like, for some of these cameras, you might be able to shoot in 4K, but if you do slow motion, it'll be down at 1080. It'll be down at sort of standard, high definition. And you usually have significant shutter speed control. And often what's helpful in these over mobile devices or action cameras is they're often physical buttons and wheels and things that will help you control shutter speed, ISO, maybe not so much your frame rate, but the aperture. Like you'll have like a little dial that you can just twist, and sometimes it's really nice, especially when you're shooting something complicated, to just have a dial that you can rotate, or a button that you can rotate or press to accomplish what you want for your image control. So now let's talk about cinema cameras. And I have an example of one right next to me here. And in fact, this is not where I want it to be. Let's just go ahead and pull it in a little bit. I've got a Canon C100 here with me. This is one of our Canon C100s that we have for a couple of our programs and have been available through production in the past. So cinema cameras are professional video camera options, and they create that cinematic look. And they are used for cinema. They're used for films. They have a higher quality image. There is significant image control. You have really full control over your image with these. Interchangeable lenses, just like that. Like I can just take this and I can just twist that off, put on a different lens, a better lens, a cheaper lens. Just gonna I don't want to take these off for very long. They have more audio connections, including professional audio connections, that we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute. Some of the cons, the focus can be really sensitive, because with these you can get that really great shallow depth of field, but sometimes that shallow depth of field is a little too shallow, and you got to be careful about it. You really, really got to learn how to take advantage of it. And depends on which lens you put on it too, how sensitive it's going to be, or how much you can control it. There's one of the big cons for a lot of people is it's a significantly higher price point. And sometimes all you're not even getting the lens. Sometimes you're not even getting all the pieces. You're just getting this body here. You're just getting the piece in the middle. For some of these, and you got to invest in everything else as well. And as you can see, the price range can range from $2,500, which might be less than a high-end DSLR, but it can also go up to tens of thousands of dollars, depending on what you're looking at. If you really want to dive into the cinematic look, there's the RE line of cameras and stuff like that. So a couple of examples. There's the Canon C200. This is Canon C100, which is less available now. C200 has superseded it in a lot of spaces. Red Komodo 6K and the Ursa Mini Pro 12K. And here you also notice that we're talking about much higher resolutions again. One of the big differences here versus what we were talking about with DSLR and mirrorless cameras is those audio connections. I have XLR connections here. I have professional grade audio that I can plug into this, and it can record at that audio at a much higher level than what anything else we talked about is. Most of these have a Super 35 sensor, which is very close to being the same as the full frame sensor. It's just the format is a little bit different. The Canon has Canon EF mount lenses, just like I was talking about. We can put this lens on a Canon DSLR, and we can take the even higher end lenses that use the EF mount and put it on here. This C200 will go 4K up to 60 frames per second. The Red Komodo here does the Canon RF mount lenses, which is the Canon mirrorless lenses. Some of these brands like Red or like Ursa, not like Ursa, like Blackmagic, who does the Ursa there. Some of these brands, they don't do lenses. They don't make their own lenses. So they just make themselves compatible with other brands. So let me just adjust that. So the Red Komodo is compatible with Canon RF mount lenses. The Ursa Mini here, the Blackmagic Ursa Mini here, is compatible with RE-PL mount lenses, which are very, very nice cinema lenses. The Red Komodo does 6K up to 40 frames per second, and the Ursa Mini Pro does 12K up to 60 frames per second. Now, do you need 6K? Do you need 12K? Do you need 8K? Not really. It can get you a really nice image. But the problem then comes in is, do you have a computer that can edit it? Do you have somewhere you can watch it? Not so much. If you're doing something and visual effects is a priority, maybe you're doing a lot of compositing and green screening, stuff like that, these higher resolutions can be super, super helpful for that. More information that you can work with. Controlling your image with these, as I've said, like, you have such amazing control over your image. The sensor is large. You have a wide range of ISO, and almost all cinema cameras are going to give you, especially more recent ones. Older ones, maybe not as much, but almost all recent ones are going to give you that dual native ISO option, which means you have a low ISO that is pretty clean, but you may also have a really high ISO that's pretty clean. Interchangeable lenses give you a lot of options for your depth of field and what kind of things that you can use. Like, these usually are very compatible with a wide range of lenses, as long as the lens mount matches. Prime lenses with wide aperture can give you that really great shallow depth of field, and prime lenses are just not zoom lenses. So it's a prime lens is a 50 millimeter lens versus like a 50 to 100 or something like that. Frame rate and shutter speed usually have a range of common and uncommon frame rates. They offer several options for slow motion capture. Again, like the DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, oftentimes the more you're slowing it down, the lower the resolution that you can record. Again, significant control over your shutter speed with the cinema cameras. So let's kind of run down what the big considerations were for each of these different camera types. There's budget. Depending on how much money you have to spend, it's going to affect which camera you should be considering. Remember that the cost of the camera, as the cost of the camera goes up, oftentimes we're only talking about just getting the body of the camera, and then you also have to get lenses and other components that's going to make it more usable. So even as these prices go up, you actually have to spend even more around it. So as the camera price goes up, you should really consider that your budget overall is going to need to go up for it. Mobile devices is the best option for those of you who are working on a tight budget. If you have almost nothing to spend, but you have a good semi-recent mobile device in your pocket, use that. Spend whatever little budget you have on something else. Action cameras. If you have less than $1,000 to spend on your camera rig, this is a good option for you. And this is just talking purely about budget right now. DSLR mirrorless cameras, I would say that if you have less than $5,000 to spend on your full camera rig, not just the camera, but lenses, but stabilizers, some other stuff that lights, some other things that we're going to talk about. Cinema cameras. If you have a significant budget to spend on your camera rig, and that includes the camera, that includes the lenses, that's going to include lights, that's going to include audio. This is, if you are looking like, I want to invest in a cinema camera, then what you also need to be thinking is, I want to get hired to shoot for other people because they are expensive and you might want to recoup that money. It's really the best option for those of you who are thinking about that. I want to get hired to shoot. Audio. Is audio important for what you're shooting? Do you need to capture an interview or dialogue? That's going to affect which camera is best for your project and how well it works with it. Now, mostly we're talking about being able to record directly into the camera. In almost all situations, you can also record audio separately and reconnect it in post with varying levels of success, depending upon your experience with it. Something worth testing out. We won't get into details on this today. For mobile devices, there's an increasing amount of options for capturing audio with them. It is not the priority of the device, though, so the audio is not going to be quite as good as in some other cases, or if you recorded it separately. But there are all kinds of audio devices that have been released, microphones that connect directly to your mobile device. And that's because it's become very popular to use mobile devices for vloggers or content creators on social media. So they can get that good audio with those. Action cameras, audio is not a priority at all. And if you need to get good audio and you're shooting with an action camera, get separate audio. Like, the audio with these is just not a priority with these action cameras. So don't even really kind of try to figure that out. Really, if you're saying, well, I've got a GoPro and that's what I need to shoot with, okay, get a separate audio recorder and record your audio with that and synchronize them in post. DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, the built-in audio is usually poor. Like if you try to use the built-in microphone on them, which I am not using right now, by the way. Like I said, I'm shooting this on an A7S, and let me just show you real quick so you can see what I'm doing. I'm using this little Rode desk mic. That's what you're hearing me through. because I was not going to trust that built-in audio. And I didn't want to plug in a separate audio, which would have been fine. I could have plugged in a separate microphone to this and run it in there, and we probably would have gotten a fine signal. But I wanted something that was a little closer to me and separate from the camera. And separate recording is very normal for shooting with DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. There's a wide range of audio devices available for that. Cinema cameras, the internal audio recording is better than everything else we've talked about so far. Separate audio recording is usually common because oftentimes when you're shooting on a cinema camera, you're shooting a larger production. You have a lot more people involved, and you might need somebody who's really dedicated to paying attention to your audio. And so oftentimes they're recording on a separate device. But you can record directly to any of these cinema cameras. Again, they have the XLR inputs. They have the professional grade input that you can leverage. Lighting. So the sensor and lens quality can affect how much light you may need to add to what you're shooting. Mobile devices, as I was saying before, the improvements in low light capability are usually software or AI driven, so your results may vary there. Action cameras are just not great in low light conditions. They do their best with it, but they're built to be in natural light. They're built to be out in the sun. That's what they're for. So kind of keep that in mind. Keep in mind what it's for. DSLR mirrorless cameras are typically good in low light. A lot of them have those full frame sensors, as we mentioned. Interchangeable lenses give you more options there. When possible, shoot with more light, like shoot outside when it's in the day, when the sun is out. Add lights. There are light kits available, or just turn on every light that you can. Cinema cameras is going to be the best results in low light conditions. Those dual native ISO really helps, and to avoid having too much noise on the image when you're shooting. But again, like with audio and with cinema cameras, you're often going to be working with more of a crew, and you might have a full lighting setup for that, which would also be a budgetary consideration. Lens options affect what the aperture is, how close or far you need to be from the subject when you're shooting, which can also affect the audio on them. Mobile devices, you typically have a wider lens with a larger aperture. It's fixed to the device, so you're limited to what's built in. Even lenses you can purchase for these. So sometimes you can purchase, they sell little kits, lenses for mobile devices, for iPhones, Samsungs, whatever. That's not really a separate lens. That is kind of just a modifier for the lens that's already there. So you're still somewhat limited by that lens that's already built into the mobile device. But that's not to say that those aren't helpful, just that it's not the same. Action cameras, they favor wider, often extremely wide angle lenses, and little, if any, opportunity to change your lens. Oftentimes they have kind of a built-in zoom into it, which you may or may not notice because it's kind of built into the inside of the camera and it's shifting inside. But the ability for that to change is limited because, again, they need to be very durable. And one of the things that helps them be as durable as they are is there's a minimum amount of moving parts. The less moving parts they are, the more they can survive a fall or a drop or something. Cinema cameras, interchangeable lenses, wide range of lenses from budget primes to the highest end camera lenses, like lenses that cost as much as a truck. I'm not exaggerating. There are ridiculously pricey lenses out there, but they're amazing. They look amazing, but we don't all need those. So there's a wide variety of options available there for your cinema cameras. Now, one of the things that I think is also important here to talk about, now that we've talked a lot about these different kinds of cameras and about what are the features of cameras that we need to think about. Well, what are the usages for these different types of cameras? There's cost, flexibility, and considerations around your audio and your lighting. So mobile devices. What's the best use for your mobile device? Are you making a travelogue? You're traveling around. You're visiting Paris or the Bahamas or wherever, and you want to shoot what you're seeing. Well, your mobile device is right there with you. You can get good quality images. You can get it right away. You don't have to carry anything else with you. You can get those those audio editions so you can record yourself in those spaces. One of the nice things about those types of videos is it's also people who are watching it aren't expecting you to have the highest end audio or anything like that. What they want to see is they want to see where you are in the moment, not that you had to do a whole big setup. So mobile devices are fantastic for that. Personal vlogs. If you're just going to be sitting and talking to us and telling us about your day or telling us about how you think about some topic in pop culture or something else, you don't need the highest end cameras for that. Do it on your mobile device. Get a little tripod for it. Set it up. Record that. Are you making videos for social media? TikTok, Instagram, whatever the next big thing will be. Mobile devices kind of like those apps were kind of built for you to use your mobile device for that. It's in your pocket. It's ready to use wherever you go. Get a compatible microphone that improves your audio, and you're going to be off to the races. If those are your goals, if that's what you're trying to do, that's what I recommend. Travelogues, personal vlogs, social media video, anything of that level, go for the mobile device. Save yourself a little money and just spend a little bit on improving your audio. Maybe add a light, like a ring light or something. Action cameras. These are best used for their primary purpose, which is to capture sports, to capture outdoor activities. Maybe you want to use it for B-roll. Like that is their best use. You can stretch that use. You can experiment more with that 100%. Always recommend experimenting, have some fun with it. But if you're looking to do something around sports, especially outdoor sports, your action camera is your best bet. DSLRs and mirrorless cameras, these are great for budget, narrative, and documentary shoots. You're making a short film, you're making a documentary, you're making a feature film. Like DSLRs and mirrorless cameras are going to take you really far. You should have separate audio recording for those though, just because the DSLR or mirrorless audio is just not great. And you want something that's a little bit better. Cinema camera is your best option for a narrative or documentary film. And one of the things to keep in mind though is even the simplest of the cinema cameras, your best results are going to come from having a couple of people working with it. So usually on a larger shoot, you'll have at least one camera operator and at least one assistant camera. So somebody who's helping them set it up, helping them make sure that the focus is right. There's a lot of moving parts to working with those cameras. So you need a few more hands. You need a few more eyes on it. And that can really expand what, sort of the requirements as far as like budget or just how big your team is. I would say that if you're trying to do it all yourself with your production, which I don't generally recommend, collaborate, meet up with people, work together, network. But if you do got to do it all yourself, mobile devices, action cameras are your best bet. If you have a small team, DSLR mirrorless cameras are pretty good for a small team. If you can put together a big team, 10 people, 20 people, something like that for your whole production, for everything, for camera, for audio, for lighting, for production design, then a cinema camera is a good bet. Like sometimes people will grab a cinema camera and think they can do everything themselves. And you can, it's just a lot harder. And you usually end up sacrificing quality somewhere else. So if you're trying to, as they say, one man band it or one person band the thing, stick to the simpler devices, stick to the mobile devices, stick to the action cameras. you'll get better results there. So let's talk about accessories. We'll go through this a little quicker so we got a little bit more time for questions. I don't know if you can tell I'm excited about talking about these things. So I'm interested in this topic. So I'll go off a little bit on some of it. Audio accessories. We already touched on this a little bit. You may need more audio accessories depending upon what you're working with, but also depending on what your goals are. What is my final product? Usually there are 3 ways that you're capturing audio: built-in microphone, an external microphone inputted into your device, or the external audio recorder, external recorder. Excuse me. The microphone you use is dictated by the camera oftentimes. If you're plugging it directly into the camera, your options are usually 3.5 millimeter, which again is kind of a standard headphone jack look. XLR, which is what you'll see on your professional cameras, what I showed you on the C100 a little bit ago, or mini XLR. And the mini XLRs, you can kind of see it there. It's an XLR, professional grade audio. It's just a little tinier. And there's a few cinema cameras that do that. And that's because they try for more compact cinema cameras, those are available. When you're working with sound, and I won't, sound is a big topic. We won't get into it too much, but it's really, really important when you're thinking about what camera you're going to use to sit down and really think about how important is the audio to what I'm shooting, and think about like, how is that going to play into the camera that I'm using? Like I said before, if you're doing mobile devices or you're doing action cameras and you need good audio, you need to get interview audio. You're getting dialogue because people are talking to each other, whatever it is, get a separate audio recorder. Just do not trust the mobile device to get great audio for that. Mobile device can get great audio for a vlog, for a travelogue, for just social media video. That's fine. If you're trying to do a documentary, if you're trying to do a narrative film and you want to use those devices, you can. There's a whole film that somebody made with the backup camera of a car, but they recorded their audio separately. And that's one of the things that you want to take into consideration with your camera selection. How important is my audio? Very rarely are you going to have great built-in sound in anything less than a cinema camera. You have decent built-in sound for DSLRs when you plug in a separate microphone. But short of a cinema camera, the audio is just not going to be great. You need something separate. And there's a phrase that gets shared around a lot: sound is half the picture. People will notice bad sound, and it can really ruin it for them. So again, just to kind of emphasize this one more time, if sound is important to what you're doing, make sure that you can get, if you can't get good sound in your camera, get good sound separately. So let's talk about lenses real quick. Before investing in a camera that allows for interchangeable lenses, you kind of need to understand the various types of lenses and their compatibility with cameras and how that has an effect in your lens, on your images. Focal length is the distance between the lens and the image sensor when the subject is in focus. This is what you look for when you're looking for lenses. You want to keep in mind the cost of lenses. In some cases, they can exceed the cost of the camera. Do your research, because just because it's more expensive doesn't mean that it's, it's definitely like an expensive lens is often going to be really great. But there are inexpensive lenses that look really good too. One in particular is Canon has a 50 millimeter lens. Oftentimes it's referred to as the Nifty 50. It's inexpensive, relatively, really nice look. Sometimes you find stuff like that. Like it's a cheaper lens, but it's still a really good looking lens. But you just kind of want to be careful, and you want to learn, like, well, here are the cameras that I want to use, or here's the camera that I want to use. learn about the lenses that are compatible with it, and do your research. There are a lot of YouTube tutorials or YouTube reviews of lenses. People love to talk about this stuff. And don't just watch one, watch a couple of them, watch a couple of comparisons and decide what you like the look of, because what the person reviewing it likes might not be the same as what you're valuing. But it's worth it. If you're doing interchangeable, it's worth it to take that time. There's zoom lenses, there's prime lenses, kind of broadly speaking. Zoom lenses are ones where you can change the focal length. I can go from a wide 24 to a close, like to a telephoto 70, or you can go 70 to 300 or 200 to 500, or you can go 18 to 107 or something like that. The wider the range and the longer the lens, the more costly it's going to be. Also, zoom lenses tend to have the default, the smaller, the aperture can't go as small as a lot of prime lenses, and that's just because it has to have all these functions for zooming. And if its zoom does open really wide, it's going to be very expensive. Prime lenses, fixed focal length, you can't zoom. You often get a better image with them for less money. And they usually have the smaller f-stops. They usually have a wider open aperture. Why would I choose, if zoom doesn't give me the same thing, it doesn't look quite as good at as a similar prime, why would I get the zoom at all? It's because sometimes you need to change your focal length. For example, if you're doing documentary, you're shooting B-roll or something like that, you need to change the focal length. You need to go from a wide to a close-up really fast. And you can only do that on a zoom. If you're trying to switch out lenses, prime lenses on your camera, like you have to like unscrew one, put the lens caps on it, unscrew in the other one, take the lens cap off, start recording again. It's a process. So a prime is something where most of the time when I'm working with these kinds of cameras with interchangeable lenses, I'm using primes when I'm doing something like narrative production or documentary production, like interviews, where I can say, hey, let's take a second. We're going to switch the lens here. Or I'm going to put one lens on. That's all we're going to use. We're only going to use a 50. We're only going to use 100. We're only going to use 24, whatever it is. But if I'm out and I'm shooting events, or I'm shooting again, B-roll, or I need to be more dynamic with it, I need to be able to change in the moment, then I want a zoom lens. It may not give me quite the level of image I'm getting with a prime, but it gives me that flexibility. Because, and I hope this comes through in everything today, is that what's important is that there is not just one thing that's always going to work for you. It's that you need to think about, what are my needs for this project? And that is what's going to drive what your camera choices are going to be. Because it's not one of these is always better than the others. It's what are my needs and what's better for that need today. Lens mounts is important to understand. We talked about this a little bit. These different cameras take different lens mounts. You can get adapters. There are advantages and disadvantages to adapters. One thing to take under consideration, if you start investing in a particular brand, or you're like, okay, I've decided to get a Canon camera, to a degree, you're also investing in a certain lens ecosystem. Like, okay, well, now I'm using Canon EF lenses. And if you're getting lenses, and that may drive your decisions in the future. If you decide to get a new camera, if you decide to change camera brands, you may need to make sure that you have something that's compatible with the lenses you already have, because you already have those lenses, and those lenses can work on a wide variety of cameras. So it's worth thinking sometimes, if you're going to be investing in interchangeable lens cameras, sometimes it's worth thinking more about which lenses do I like more than which camera, because those lenses can live with you, can go on with you into the future a lot longer than some of these cameras can. So sometimes it's worth thinking about, what's the lens ecosystem I like? I really like how Canon lenses work, or how they look, or the options they have, or the price range they have. I really like those ones. So that's what I'm going to invest in. And maybe I'll get a camera that's compatible with those lenses. And we talked about the lens focal length, 18 millimeters super wide, 300 millimeters super close. How close these different focal lengths are, though, or how far away they are, is also, or how far away they look, is also a function of dependent upon the sensor size. Because a full frame sensor will be wider at 18 millimeters than an APS-C sensor. So for example, and I'm just throwing this out as an example, if that 18 millimeters on a full frame, oops, jumped forward. If that 18 millimeters on a full frame, the an APS-C might look more like that 24 millimeter. So something to kind of, that's one of the things that's a difference there. Stabilization equipment that you can get that goes with it. I have another example for this. Let me just pull this up. I have right here, this is a Ronin S gimbal. So you plant the camera on it and you can walk around with them. Stabilization can be gimbals like that. It can be tripods like what I got the C100 on here. They can be shoulder rigs. There's a lot of options that you can use for stabilizing, which is basically like, how do I get a steady shot, whether I'm moving or if I just need to put the camera somewhere and shoot, like with a tripod. So uses for these tripods, usually something that you're using for something like seated interviews or vlogging, or if you're doing narrative production, oftentimes people just put their camera on a tripod. Shoulder rigs, if you're moving, you're following people, moving content. Gimbals like the Ronin I just showed you, usually for moving content, you're following people. Or action, those are what you'd get for them. Shoulder rigs, it's great for videographers if you're out doing events or anything like that. The real key to what it does for you with shoulder mounts is it takes the weight out of your hands and it helps distribute the weight of the camera and carrying it, and any additional stuff you have connected to the camera makes it easier for you to move. Gimbals, it's a camera support system. They're great. Gimbals are great. They give you super smooth looking shots. The thing that I'm going to warn you about though with gimbals is if you get one or you borrow one or you rent one, you need to practice with it and you need to learn how to work with it, because it looks simple, but it's not, because you have to balance the camera. You've got to sit there and you've got to balance the camera before the device can keep it balanced. It doesn't know what balance is. You have to show it what balance is, if that makes any kind of sense. And I'm advising this because I've run into many cases where people had a gimbal on set and we were working with it and they just kept getting frustrated because it wasn't just working. And I said, well, did you balance it? And they said, well, you just put it on and it balances. That's not how it works. You got to sit there, you got to balance it. If you change lenses on an interchangeable lens camera with a gimbal, you have to rebalance it because the weight changed, the size of the camera changed sometimes. Sometimes these camera lenses are longer or shorter. And so a gimbal setup is complicated. But once you use it, you're just kind of going around and you're shooting and you're able to really get great smooth control. But it's something that you must practice with and you must respect and get to know. Otherwise, you're going to be very disappointed. In general, the thing that, just to kind of wrap up this section here, is before investing in hundreds of dollars worth of equipment or thousands of dollars worth of equipment, or even tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, fully understand what you're planning to create and scale to that, or consider how you can scale to that or how you should adapt to that. Research the cameras that you're interested in. Handle them in person when possible. Head down to, B&H if you're here in New York, or any of the other camera shops that might let you get hands-on with the camera and see how you like it. Do you like the way it feels in your hands? Can you understand the buttons? Can you get through the menus? Watch YouTube reviews and tutorials. That stuff's all free. Classes like this, also free. Learn about it and learn about what you need. Experiment with it. You can borrow with it. If you have a little bit of cash to spend and you want to spend a little bit more time with it than just going into a shop, there are rental opportunities out there. Here in New York, there are dozens of rental houses, or there are websites where you can just rent from other creatives for, maybe $25 for a day or $100 for the day. And you can take the camera out and you can practice with it, and you can see, how do I like it, without having to commit to purchasing. Research compatible accessories and their costs. The camera itself might be affordable, but then you may have to get a lens. It doesn't come with a lens, so you got to get a lens on top of it, and you're doubling your cost. There are some cameras out there that are great. The one that comes to my mind is like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema cameras. They're great cameras, beautiful image, great compact size. You can, especially here in New York, you want to be able to, if I'm shooting in an apartment, I don't need a camera that's huge. I need something that I can just fit in a small space. Those cameras are great, the Pocket Cinema cameras. Problem is that you gotta then build out your full rig. You need more power than the batteries can usually handle. You need to get the separate lenses. You usually need to make sure that you have separate audio. There's a lot of other little things that you need to do. The screens on the back are usually a little small. You might need a separate monitor for some of them. So as you're investigating for what your needs are, start to also look at, what are the other accessories I need? Look at what kits are made available. That's usually going to tell you, like, what are people buying with it. That's one of the things that I find very useful about just going to some of these shopping websites, like a B&H website, or maybe I'll look at Adorama or something like that. And it's advancing on me on its own. Is that they also have kits, or they have suggestions for accessories you get. Go look at those and see if, like, oh wait, I'm going to need that. I'm going to need that extra piece of equipment. It's going to cost me this much. So always do your research and spend a little extra time on that. And if you can, get hands-on, like, see what you like before you commit. So I know I went a little longer than I wanted to. Apologies for that. I get excited talking about this stuff. But I did want to put it out there for questions, for if anybody had any questions about cameras or devices, or anything that you've been encountering in your creation. I'll just give it a second. I know there's a little bit of a delay. I see that we have a question from, or not question so much as a comment from Matt Lewis here. I'm just going to put it up on the screen for you all to see. A future CME session could be audio for creatives, just like this presentation, but only for audio. Just a thought. Don't tempt me. I might do that. I will tend to go on a lot about audio, but that's a good idea. Like, and what I would say is, if you're very interested in audio, one of the things that I would look to for the future, or for the near future, is the podcast classes that we're going to be offering, because by necessity we'll be talking a lot about audio in those. Audio is a very important piece of the puzzle, whether we're talking about creating on camera, whether we're talking about podcasting, whether we're talking about anything else. You want to be able to hear what's going on. And one of the things about audio is it's not very forgiving. If you record bad audio, you can't usually salvage it much in post. They try to give you a lot of options for it, but you usually can't. Usually you've either recorded good audio or you haven't. I'll leave it open for if there are any other questions. While I do, I just wanted to give you a quick reminder about what's coming up for this week. Again, tomorrow night, the present and future of low-budget filmmaking. I'm very excited to be talking to filmmakers Victoria Negri and Jacques Soire about the kind of projects that they're doing, And I'm very excited to talk to bring in Joseph Shahadi, who is the executive director of the Art of Brooklyn Film Festival. He can give us that broad perspective on film. Thursday night, we've got our networking, which is the only thing that's on Zoom. Everything else is on the same link you came to this. For those of you who are wondering, how can I ask a question right now? I see we got a question. I'll hold for just a second. If you're on the MNN website, just go ahead and click on Watch on YouTube, and you'll be able to see the chat. And then we will be able to pull that in and answer your questions. Then you can ask questions in the chat there. So Thursday night, speed networking with creatives. Our whole team is going to be there working with you, networking, connecting with each other. And Friday night, we're very excited for our virtual production panel, which is going to be hosted by our Director of Media Education, Tiffany Blunt. It's going to be featuring Adrian Miranda, panelist, Aya Evans, Andrew Aniceto. And that, again, will be accessed the same way. You just come to the same link on mnn.org. It's in that email address. And I see we got a couple more questions. And I'm just going to leave that up there while we address the questions that we've got. Let's see, we got Xavier Martin asks, what are the best frame rates for recording or shooting in a nature documentary? So I think that's a great question. So if you're doing a nature documentary, if you're doing interviews with people about nature, I would recommend that you shoot those interviews at 24 frames per second. But I would go and I would shoot all the nature stuff, the birds or the frogs or whatever you're doing, trees, shoot that at a higher frame rate. Try for at least, I would shoot minimum 60 frames per second for most of that. With a lot of animals, if you can, I would bump it up to 120. I would see if you can't do that, because then you can get a lot of that. Now, keep in mind with those that when you shoot at the higher frame rate, you got to increase that shutter, or you got to make that shutter speed faster. So that means you're going to have less light. So you're going to be wanting to shoot a lot during the day, unless you get those special night cameras. That's a whole other ball of wax to deal with. But I would say that at minimum, if you're out and you're shooting in nature, 60 frames per second. And then Nina Early asked, what cameras will we be using at MNN on 38th? So now I can only speak to in detail on the classes and production. They have new cameras that are being set up in the studios. I will say that 38th Street is our new studios are all Blackmagic. So we'll have Blackmagic cameras in them, Blackmagic switchers. So from a studio perspective, it's all Blackmagic. For education, all the cameras I showed you are cameras that will be available in specific classes. So these are all this Insta360 X3. This is the camera we teach in the 360 class, production class that will be offered in the first round of classes that is coming up very soon. So this is what's in the 360 class. We are going to be offering some longer form classes. We mentioned these in the presentation last night, the storyteller classes, storyteller programs, which are longer term programs, which will be premiering in the future. Those aren't going to be coming up first. A7S that I showed you and that I'm shooting on right now. This is the camera that we are currently planning on. I'm not going to say that we're definitely doing it because things change, but currently planning on for our documentary storytellers. For our narrative storytelling program, we are currently planning on, and again, I'm just saying currently, as things can change, plans can shift, the C100 that we have. For our mobile production class, We have iPads that we do, although we would encourage you to bring in your own mobile devices, because that way you can learn and practice with your own mobile devices in the mobile production class. But those are the cameras that are available. We still have the Sony Z150s, which we're going to be using for some of our private training classes that we do. We do programs with nonprofits and for affinity groups, and we're kind of focusing the use of those cameras there. As far as outside of the classes, what's available through for field reservations or anything like that is a conversation for production. And I know, Nina, you also had a question about reserving the cameras. If you are in one of the classes where we're going to be leveraging those cameras that I mentioned, then you will be able to use those cameras for class projects. Again, outside of it, field equipment related things, that's all a production department thing. I can't really speak to that, and I wouldn't, because that's their field. Now, I also see that Angela asked us, what frame rate would I shoot live bands on stage? Now, that's a great question, and I've had a lot of fun with shooting bands in the past. Most of the time, I'm going to shoot at probably 24, maybe 30 frames per second, depending on the goal. But there's an advantage to shooting potentially at 60 frames per second. Now, the problem there is oftentimes you're shooting bands on stage. The lighting isn't really for video. The lighting's really for an audience, and they can be very bright lights. But the thing to keep in mind about cameras is the way the camera processes light is different than us. We don't need as much light as the camera does to see something, because our eye is just always, it's open and it's receiving light and we're processing it. And so we kind of auto shift in our brain to an appropriate exposure. It's not really what it is, but it's close enough. And the camera can't really do that. So it's fun to shoot at a higher frame rate with bands on a stage, because you can slow it down. You can kind of get that slow motion. And I will say, one of my favorite things to do when I shoot bands, when I can do it, is I'll get a really fast shutter speed, just as fast as I can do, so I can shoot at the drummer, because it's really fun to see drumsticks at a high shutter speed, because you don't have that motion blur, because drummers are moving real fast. But you can get like a really cool effect, or just like guitar strings, you can get really close at a high shutter speed. It's a lot of fun. When you can do it, if there's a lot of light, or if you have something that otherwise works really well in low light, and you can have like a really wide open aperture, I might shoot at a 60, or even if possible a 120, because then you can really slow it down. You can get the higher shutter speed to go with that higher frame rate, so you can get those slow motion shots if you want them. You don't have to use them. That's my preference. Most of the time, though, you got to kind of play it a little safe. And 60 might be what you want to stick to. If you got multiple cameras, I'd shoot at a few different rates. But I try to go for 60 if you have a wide enough aperture, if you're shooting on a full frame camera, so you have a little bit more flexibility in the light you're doing, or if you're not as worried about having a high ISO and having to deal with noise. But yeah, I'd probably go for about a 60, so you got a little bit of flexibility there. But again, you got me all excited about fast shutter speeds and how cool drums and guitar strings can look in those. So that's what we have for today. And very glad to have you guys. I'm not seeing any other new questions, so we can wrap up. But thrilled to have you guys. Please, again, join us for the rest of the week. You can sign up for our email list. New York City Center for Media Education .org is the website, or cme.mn.org also works. And I do see one more question. I'll answer that in just a second. You can follow us on all the social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and look for more tips coming up soon on our YouTube, MNN, at MNN Education. Yeah, we're at NYCCME on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And I do see one more question I'll go ahead and answer here as we're wrapping up. What would be the best camera when starting a YouTube channel, a mobile device, or a DSLR camera? I would say it depends on the content you're going for. If you're starting the YouTube channel and it's just you, kind of in a setup like this where you're just talking to the camera, like I would just go with a mobile device to start. See how it goes. See how you like that. Experiment with a little bit, experiment with your content a little bit, because one of the things that's really the most important with YouTube, with a YouTube channel, is having the content that's compelling and interesting and engaging. I mean, you can look at plenty of YouTube channels where the quality of the video is not that great, but people are watching it and they're sticking with it because they're engaged by the person. So you can kind of start, save yourself a little bit money to start with your mobile device, see how that works for you, see how it works as far as like kind of building your connection, building your brand, building your audience, and then come back to the DSLRs. So again, thank you guys for joining us. Very much appreciate you guys participating. Great questions, and I hope I'll see you all tomorrow at our panel. Bring some great questions for the panel, for the panelists. I'm sure they're going to be very excited to hear from you. Have a great rest of your day.